On March the 13th, Trump's administration stunned the world by imposing a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other crucial industrial goods. The announcement was loud, brash, and confident, but it unleashed something far more disruptive than anyone could have anticipated. Factories across the northern United States, long reliant on seamless trade with Canadian suppliers, were immediately thrown into chaos. Detroit's auto plants, found their parts from Ontario, were suddenly 25% more expensive. In Cleveland, a family-owned manufacturer had to lay off a fifth of its workers, their decades-old operation brought to its knees by the sudden spike in costs. Border towns from Maine to Minnesota felt the impact within days, as grocery stores struggled to keep shelves stocked and basic goods skyrocketed in price. Yet Trump doubled down. On national television, he boasted, "These tariffs will bring in billions, and American industry will thrive." But his economic advisors quietly warned of catastrophic consequences. Local economies began to buckle, opinion polls turned sharply against him, and public anger spread like wildfire through town halls and factory floors. As the United States wrestled with the fallout, something unexpected was brewing to the north. Canada wasn't about to take this sitting down. In fact, what came next would turn Trump's trade war into an all-out economic brawl. So stay with me. Canada's retaliation. Canada's response to Trump's tariffs was swift, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Within 48 hours, Canada's Prime Minister announced a massive retaliatory tariff worth $30 billion United States dollars on American imports: fruit juices, wine, household goods, cosmetics, paper products. But the most punishing move was reserved for America's most isolated state, Alaska. Understanding Alaska's heavy dependence on Canadian supply routes, Canada enacted a targeted economic chokehold, imposing substantial fees on American commercial trucks traveling north through British Columbia. The Alaska Highway, a critical 2,450-kilometer route threading through Canada, became ground zero for this bold strategy. The legislation struck right at Alaska's economic lifeline. Nearly 80% of all goods entering Alaska from the United States came through this single artery. Alaskan grocery shelves quickly emptied, with milk, fresh produce, meat, and medications surging drastically in price. Within days, Alaskan residents witnessed price increases of more than 20%. In remote towns like Nome and Barrow, the situation grew dire. Families were forced to choose between essential food and critical medicines, prompting emotional pleas to state and federal officials. "My children shouldn't go hungry because of a trade dispute," an exhausted mother from Fairbanks declared tearfully on local news broadcasts. The harsh realities of living at the edge of America became painfully clear. When supply routes close, ordinary people suffer deeply. But the consequences reached further still. Alaska's vital tourism industry, dependent on cruise ships that must dock at Canadian ports, suddenly saw bookings drop sharply. Cruise lines scrambled to adjust itineraries and faced costly delays and cancellations. Thousands of seasonal workers in Alaska's coastal towns, reliant upon tourism, faced layoffs or uncertain futures. Local businesses, restaurants, tour operators, hotels, expressed despair. One Juneau hotel manager solemnly warned, "If this continues, our town may not survive." Still, Canada remained firm. British Columbia's Premier David Eby defended the move, stating clearly, "We must protect our interests. America's tariffs forced our hand." Canadians, largely sympathetic to their government's tough response, stood united against what they perceived as American economic aggression. Back in Alaska, anxiety turned into outright anger. Political leaders desperately lobbied Washington, pleading for immediate relief. Yet, despite frantic appeals, the Trump administration remained silent. Alaskans felt abandoned by their government, trapped helplessly in the middle of an escalating international conflict. Across the state, panic buying became common. Citizens lined up at gas stations, supermarkets, and pharmacies, desperately trying to stockpile essentials before prices soared even higher. Local newspapers filled with letters of frustration and demands for action. with ordinary Alaskans calling Trump's policies reckless, irresponsible, and heartbreaking. The human cost was becoming painfully clear. Alaska was trapped in economic isolation. Yet Canada wasn't America's only new enemy. They just started it. But before we talk about the details and what other nations followed Canada's step, I need you to hit that subscribe button. Europe joins Canada's war. When the European Union stepped forward, its reaction wasn't mere symbolism. It was a financial bombshell. EU officials announced a devastating retaliatory tariff package worth 26 billion euros against American exports. Goods ranging from bourbon whiskey and Harley-Davidson motorcycles to iconic Levi's jeans and peanut butter faced immediate tariffs. For American CEOs, this was a nightmare scenario. Companies suddenly lost access to a market of nearly 500 million wealthy European consumers. Panic spread through corporate boardrooms from New York to Silicon Valley. Multinational corporations faced painful choices: either absorb huge losses or slash jobs drastically. Automotive giants like Ford and General Motors warned investors of multi-billion-dollar losses. Iconic American brands saw their stock prices plunge sharply overnight. One CEO of a famous bourbon company appeared visibly distressed in televised interviews, explaining the stark choice ahead: cut jobs, raise prices, or watch our company fail. Trump's tariffs have left us no options. Meanwhile, European leaders openly rebuked Trump's economic strategy. The European Commission president warned publicly: tariffs burden businesses and consumers alike. We cannot and will not stand idle. France's President Emmanuel Macron quickly aligned himself with Canada, calling Canada Europe's strongest ally in North America, united in resisting Trump's tariffs. Ordinary Europeans, too, felt empowered by their leader's firm stance. A viral social media campaign emerged, urging European consumers to boycott Trump's America. American businesses watched helplessly as European customers turned away, choosing local alternatives. The economic damage quickly spiraled. Yet Trump seemed astonishingly indifferent. Amidst widespread turmoil, he hosted a lavish White House event, promoting Elon Musk's Tesla cars, applauding the billionaire's contributions as a great American patriot. Economists, analysts, and media pundits openly questioned Trump's judgment, calling the event a distraction and public relations stunt. For everyday Americans, however, the damage was deeply personal. Small businesses across the United States shuttered or downsized operations. In towns and cities nationwide, job losses mounted quickly, and consumer confidence plunged. As European tariffs hammered American businesses, communities began openly questioning Trump's priorities. While businesses scrambled, Trump made his most shocking proposal yet: annex Canada. Trump's stunning proposal. In a moment that stunned the world, Trump advisor Howard Lutnick floated a solution so audacious it seemed like a punchline. If tariffs cause so much trouble, perhaps we should simply absorb Canada into the United States as our 51st state. Delivered on national television, this offhand comment sent shockwaves across both sides of the border and ignited a firestorm of backlash. The reaction from Canada was swift and unrelenting. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau denounced the suggestion as an insult to Canadian sovereignty. His response was fiery and resolute, declaring, "Canada is a proud, independent nation. We reject all attempts at economic coercion." This was no mere political maneuver. Trudeau's words galvanized citizens from coast to coast. Canadian cities saw immediate protests, with people marching in solidarity against what they perceived as a direct assault on their national identity. Flags were waved, signs were raised, and chants of "We are not the 51st state" echoed in the streets. Memes mocking the proposal circulated widely, with Canadians pointing out that their country, far from needing absorption, was a global leader in progressive policies, universal health care, and environmental stewardship. Many saw Lutnick's comment as imperialistic arrogance, a throwback to eras of colonial domination. European leaders quickly stepped in to support Canada. France's president openly criticized the proposal, calling it a reckless destabilization of our closest ally. Germany's chancellor warned that such rhetoric would only deepen existing fractures between North America and Europe. The European Union's top diplomat condemned the notion as a betrayal of the spirit of international cooperation, further souring already tenser relations between the United States and its key partners. Within the United States, the fallout was equally tumultuous. Congress became a battleground of fiery rhetoric. A handful of lawmakers defended Trump's bold stance as thinking outside the box, while many others labeled the idea as diplomatic madness and dangerously destabilizing. Town hall meetings across America saw constituents demanding explanations. Protesters marched on Capitol Hill, accusing the administration of ignoring pressing domestic concerns in favor of creating international chaos. What had started as an ill-advised remark quickly spiraled into a geopolitical and cultural crisis. Canada stood firm, rallying support from allies around the world, while within the U.S., citizens grew increasingly divided. The fallout was immediate, and it would only worsen as the economic consequences of the trade war began to fully materialize. Yet as diplomacy burned, a deeper economic crisis ignited at home. Wall Street plunges into chaos. The first tremors of the economic earthquake rippled through Wall Street on an ordinary morning. As traders read the news, the weight of the tariffs hit the stock market with force. By mid-morning, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had dropped by over 330 points, sending investors into a frenzy. This wasn't a minor correction. This was a full-blown panic, triggered by the uncertainty of a trade war that now seemed like more than just political posturing. The emotional toll on retirees was palpable. Pension funds tied to the market suddenly shrank in value, leaving countless seniors worried about how they would sustain their monthly income. Middle-aged workers, nearing retirement, saw years of careful planning wiped out in hours. One retiree who had carefully saved since the 1970s found her portfolio's value slashed by 20% in just a few weeks. She described it as feeling like the ground disappearing beneath her feet. But it wasn't only the individual investors who suffered. Large corporations, especially those tied to international trade, started cutting back. Hiring freezes became the norm, while talks of layoffs gained traction. The financial sector braced for a chain reaction, as declining stock values meant reduced corporate budgets, fewer expansions, and stifled innovation. Each passing day brought a new headline about another company halting its plans for overseas growth or canceling a major domestic project. With every moment, the market fallout deepened. What had started as a calculated tariff policy quickly unraveled into widespread economic instability. The once steady Dow Jones seemed to lurch unpredictably, leaving financial analysts and everyday citizens alike questioning when or if the market would stabilize. Amid this uncertainty, it became clear that the tariffs were not the temporary fix many had hoped. They were instead a long-term burden, shaking the foundations of both public confidence and economic strategy. And just as Wall Street reeled, another bombshell dropped. While investors scrambled, the impact of the tariffs was about to hit America's schools in a way no one expected. And here's how. The education catastrophe, 50% cut. As Wall Street wobbled, a quieter but equally devastating crisis unfolded in the classrooms and hallways of America's public schools. The federal government announced massive workforce reductions at the Department of Education, with nearly 50% of the department's employees let go. For schools already struggling with tight budgets, this news felt like a death blow. Teachers across the country were caught in the crossfire. Districts, unsure of how they would make up the difference, began issuing layoff notices. At a small elementary school in Iowa, one special education teacher described the heartbreak of packing up her classroom. "I had spent years building a safe space for my students. Now it's gone," she said, her voice breaking. Parents with disabled children were left scrambling, knowing that the programs their kids depended on might never return. The loss extended far beyond teachers. Support staff, counselors, librarians, bus drivers suddenly found themselves unemployed. For many, this meant more than just losing a paycheck. It meant losing a community, a sense of purpose, and the ability to make a difference in young lives. The broader implications were dire. Test scores, already a source of anxiety in many districts, began to drop as class sizes ballooned. Fewer teachers meant less individualized attention, fewer extracurricular activities, and diminished student engagement. Rural schools, which relied heavily on federal grants and resources, faced the greatest challenges. Some were forced to shut down entirely, consolidating into distant, overcrowded schools that left students with hour-long commutes each day. With education in freefall, the future of the American workforce looked increasingly bleak. The foundation of any thriving economy is an educated, skilled populace. But with funding slashed and teachers disappearing, that foundation began to crack. Parents voiced their outrage at school board meetings, but the problem went far beyond local control. This was a systemic collapse, rooted in federal policy decisions that prioritized short-term economic battles over long-term stability. And as teachers packed their desks and students lost hope, the next wave of economic turmoil was already breaking. America's farmers, long seen as the backbone of the nation, were about to face their own nightmare: losing China. Farmers' nightmare. Believe it or not, but American farmers, with all the soybean fields of the Midwest stretched endlessly under the summer sun, fear one thing: China. And right now, the farmers tending to these vast fields are worrying. The Chinese government had just announced that it would halt all agricultural imports from the United States. This retaliation was not a symbolic gesture. It was a devastating blow to a key sector of the American economy. Are you still watching but have not subscribed yet? Why? It's free and easy. Just do it, and don't forget to ring the bell icon too. In years past, nearly 40% of American soybeans went to China. By the end of the year, that number had plummeted to a mere 18%. Farmers who had invested in new equipment, expanded their operations, or taken out loans based on reliable export demand, suddenly found themselves drowning in unsold crops. Warehouses filled to capacity with soybeans that had nowhere to go. The prices tanked, leaving farmers no choice but to sell at a loss, or not sell at all. One farmer in Illinois, a third-generation soybean grower, faced foreclosure on his family farm. He had borrowed heavily to upgrade his equipment, confident that the steady demand from China would keep him solvent. Now he stood on the edge of bankruptcy, his once thriving fields a stark reminder of promises unkept. "This land has been in my family for 100 years, he said. "I might be the one who loses it." The ripple effects didn't stop at soybeans. Corn, wheat, and other staples also faced declining international demand as China turned to Canada, Brazil, and Europe for its agricultural needs. In one year, Brazil and Argentina accounted for 74% of China's soybean imports. U.S. farmers felt not only abandoned, but betrayed. They had played by the rules, weathered past economic storms, and trusted that their government would stand by them. Instead, they were left to fend for themselves. The strain wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. Rural communities, already grappling with declining populations, saw more young people leaving for urban areas in search of stability. The farms that once supported entire towns now struggled to maintain even basic operations. The sense of pride that came from feeding the nation was replaced by uncertainty, frustration, and anger. Yet as the dust settled over the soybean fields, a new crisis loomed on the horizon. While farmers faced an agricultural drought, another kind of drought, one that could dry up the nation's fuel supply, was about to begin. Energy crisis, oil prices, skyrocket. The gas station lights flickered in the humid night air, and drivers stared at the glowing numbers on the pump in disbelief. Canada's threat to cut oil exports had finally hit, and the result was a shockwave felt across the country. The United States, which imported over 4 million barrels of oil from Canada each day, suddenly found itself grappling with a rapid rise in prices. Truck drivers, who relied on affordable fuel to make their deliveries, began to feel the strain first. Many found that a single cross-country trip now cost twice as much. "I've been hauling freight for over 20 years, one driver from Texas said. "I've never seen fuel prices jump like this. It's like they've taken the floor out from under us." Families felt the impact too. Commuters saw their monthly gas expenses double. Households with oil-based heating faced skyrocketing bills. Industries that depended on affordable fuel, manufacturing, agriculture, construction, saw their operating costs soar. Small businesses that relied on regular shipments from wholesalers found their profit margins evaporating. The sudden spike wasn't just about dollars and cents. It was a psychological blow. For decades, Americans had enjoyed relatively stable fuel prices, relying on Canada's consistent supply of heavy crude. But as pipelines slowed and refineries struggled to adjust, that sense of reliability was gone. "It's like being in a tsunami," a refinery worker in the Midwest said. "You see it coming, but there's nothing you can do to stop it." As the energy crisis deepened, one thing became clear. This was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a long-term problem, one that would reshape transportation, consumer behavior, and the very foundation of the American economy. And while truckers filled their tanks with overpriced fuel and families tightened their budgets, another crisis brewed silently in the background, one that would send ripples through the nation's intellectual core. America's best and brightest flee abroad. A quiet exodus began to unfold, its scale hidden at first but undeniable as the months passed. With political uncertainty gripping the United States and a growing sense of disillusionment taking hold, highly skilled professionals, scientists, engineers, doctors, started looking beyond their borders for stability. The number of American families applying for Irish and German citizenship skyrocketed, increasing by 50% in just 1 year. For those with the ability to relocate, the decision seemed increasingly clear. Leave now, while opportunities still beckoned, rather than risk the long-term erosion of freedoms and stability at home. One such story was that of Dr. Emily Carter, a renowned molecular biologist. For years, Carter had run a prestigious research lab in Massachusetts, pioneering breakthroughs in renewable energy technologies. But as political pressures mounted and funding for scientific initiatives dwindled, her once secure position began to feel precarious. She watched as colleagues, mentors, and students, some of the brightest minds she'd ever known, resigned from U.S. institutions and accepted offers abroad. Germany's Max Planck Institute, with its steady funding and support for open scientific inquiry, became a beacon. Carter eventually followed suit, uprooting her family and moving to Berlin, where she would not only continue her work unimpeded, but also ensure her children would grow up in an environment of stability and opportunity. This exodus wasn't confined to the scientific community. Top tech engineers headed to Canada. Healthcare professionals moved to Australia, and even artists and writers sought refuge in nations that promised greater creative freedom. Each individual departure was a small story, but together they painted a larger picture. America's intellectual and creative foundation was cracking. By the time this trend was recognized as a full-scale brain drain, the damage was done. The transition to the next chapter of the nation's demographic reality was already underway. Aging America, the demographic ticking bomb. As the younger workforce departed, an older, grayer America was left behind. With every scientist, entrepreneur, and skilled worker who chose to leave, the country lost not just their immediate contributions, but also the future taxes, innovations, and energy they would have provided. Over time, the ratio of working-age citizens to retirees began to skew dangerously. The working population shrank, while the number of older Americans relying on pensions, Social Security, and Medicare ballooned. By 2030, the trend was clear. The country's once vibrant labor force was thinning out at an alarming rate. Those remaining struggled to shoulder the growing burden. As fewer workers contributed to public funds, state and federal budgets strained under the pressure. Some smaller towns and municipalities, faced with ballooning healthcare costs and diminished tax revenue, were forced to cut basic services. Entire communities became places of quiet desperation, where the young had left for brighter shores and the old were left to fend for themselves. The human cost was staggering. Elderly citizens, who had worked their entire lives with the expectation of a secure retirement, now found themselves in precarious situations. The promise of stable healthcare became more fragile as clinics closed and doctors moved away. Nursing homes, once reliable havens, became overcrowded and underfunded. Across the nation, families were stretched thin. Adult children scrambling to care for their aging parents while also trying to make ends meet. The phrase demographic winter entered public discourse, capturing the chill of a society that no longer had the youthful vigor to sustain itself. As the economic and social implications of this demographic shift became undeniable, a new wave of unrest was brewing. Labor revolt, nationwide protests erupt. The streets of America were filled with sound once again. Not the sound of celebration or commemoration, but of anger. Across major cities and small towns alike, workers took to the streets to demand change. Factory gates were blocked by picket lines. Warehouses shut down as delivery drivers refused to cross. And teachers marched with signs in hand, joining a nationwide movement that crossed industries and state lines. This wasn't just another labor strike. It was a full-scale revolt against economic policies that seemed to benefit only a select few while leaving millions to struggle. Auto workers in Michigan, long the backbone of America's manufacturing heartland, stood shoulder to shoulder with healthcare workers from Florida and teachers from California. Each had their own specific grievances: low wages, crumbling benefits, unsustainable workloads. But their collective anger was directed squarely at the same policies and the administration that had enacted them. One striking worker, James Lewis, had spent more than 20 years assembling trucks at a plant in Indiana. In recent years, his plant had faced wave after wave of layoffs, each round justified by rising material costs and falling profits. But when tariffs and trade wars caused those costs to soar even higher, the plant's operations shrank further. When James's own job was finally cut, he joined the protests. His story was one of many. A veteran worker who had always thought his job would be secure, now left out in the cold. The unions leading these protests were more unified and vocal than ever. They knew they weren't just fighting for better paychecks. They were fighting for the survival of their industries, their communities, and their way of life. Billions of dollars were lost as strikes spread from coast to coast, and while businesses begged for resolution, protesters made it clear they would not back down. The question now was not whether the movement would end, but whether the government would finally listen or allow the unrest to escalate further. Distraction tactics. Trump and Elon Musk. While the protests raged, the administration's attention seemed inexplicably focused elsewhere. Rather than directly addressing the nationwide unrest, President Trump held a series of high-profile events with Tesla CEO Elon Musk. These weren't quick photo ops. Instead, the White House seemed to throw its weight behind a public relations campaign that celebrated Musk's successes and praised his great patriotism. The timing could not have been worse. As factories shuttered and picket lines grew, news outlets carried images of the president touring Tesla factories and unveiling new electric vehicles. Social media erupted with criticism, accusing the administration of turning a blind eye to the mounting labor crisis. Economists and political analysts questioned the strategy. Was this a deliberate attempt to shift public attention away from the strikes? Or was it a genuine miscalculation of priorities? For the everyday American caught in the middle of the turmoil, the message seemed clear. The people's struggles were not the administration's priority. Frustrated workers and their families felt abandoned, their voices drowned out by corporate promotions and staged media events. The White House's continued praise of Musk became a lightning rod for public anger, further fueling the protests rather than calming them. In the end, the Tesla events did little to stem the tide of unrest. Instead, they became emblematic of a government perceived as disconnected from its citizens. And as tensions reached a breaking point, global rivals began quietly preparing to take advantage of the chaos. Now the question is, what will be the end of this? What is the world going to be like after all of this? Let's talk in the comments, and thanks for tuning in.